Welcome to the Retail Tech Podcast. This is Darius Vasefi talking to you today, and I have a guest with me today. His name is Kelly Goetsch from Oracle, and he is product manager for Microservices Platform at Oracle. Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me today.
Great. Did I say that the role correctly?
Yes, I'm leading product management for a platform we're building that allows customers to build and deploy and manage their own microservices.
Okay, great. The reason I wanted to talk to Kelly today is that I think that microservices are going to be a key part of the future of software. And retailers, of course, we use tons of software. And so I think this is very important for everybody to understand what microservices are and how they're going to become a part of the solution and our lives really in the future. So Kelly, if you could start by just giving us an idea of what microservices are.
Well, first, let me kind of explain how most enterprise software is developed today. So if you're building a brand new e-commerce platform, a retailer would go out and they'd hire, or they would have maybe 100 developers, right? And there'd be one big pool of developers. And then they would go out and hire 10 project managers. They'd hire 30 different ops people. They'd hire 10 DBAs. And each of these groups of people would be in their own separate organization. And a lot of times they have very different reporting structures. So whoever heads up ops is in a different reporting structure to the CIO than whoever heads up development, right? And naturally, this is a concept called Conway's Law. Conway's Law states that the software reflects the organization structure that produced it. And when you have these big horizontal teams, you end up creating these big, enormous monolithic applications where everything is very segmented. It's very isolated. So let me give you an example. If you have an existing website up and you as a developer, as a Java developer, are tasked with capturing the customer's birth date in the profile, right? It should be a pretty simple requirement to do that. So if I'm the developer, I have to now I have to get it prioritized to me. So a project manager has to tell me to do it. And then I have to go put together a plan. I have to ticket the DBA team and I have to say, hey, I need this new column added, right? And you have to go through their change management process, which involves multiple layers of review and everything else. And then you have to wait for them to stage the deployment. And then you go look and you say, all right, well, the column's there now, great. And then you have to go wait for them to deploy it to the environment that you're working in. All right, great. So, all right, already a month has passed, right?
Yeah.
And then you get to do your job, right? And it's probably 5 lines of Java code, right? That's it. It's really, really easy. You go make your change, and then you publish it to your development environment, and then your QA environment, and then your staging environment, and then your production environment. And then you have to go to the UI team, and you say, hey, there's this new property here in Java. I need you to set it. And they have their own change management process. So all of a sudden, in what should take a developer, it should take a reasonable developer, if he had access to the entire stack, it should take no more than 5 minutes to implement this change, right? It's brain dead simple. And you can't do that in an enterprise. What should take 5 minutes ends up taking 5 months. And that's not an exaggeration. And microservices, on the other hand, is a very different concept. And it has its roots even back to the foundings of Unix. And with microservices, instead of having these big horizontal layered teams, you have small cross-functional teams that do one thing, and they do one thing really well. So you'd have a profile team, and you'd say, all right, that profile team gets a project manager, it gets 5 developers, it gets 2 ops people, it gets 1 DBA, and it gets 1 UI person. And you say, you as a small team go out, and you are now responsible for that profile as a service. And any type of profile changes, that team implements. Typically, those people are sitting together. They report to the same manager, and they own API or a UI or a UI as a service. So nobody in the organization should care how they do what they do, right? Behind the scenes, they could be running MS-DOS scripts for all we care, right?
Right.
We don't really care. What matters is that that API or that UI or both are available to the rest of the enterprise. And when you have everybody in the same small team reporting to the same manager, working towards the same goal, it becomes really, really easy because that team can then build, release, deploy their microservice whenever they want to without having to do complicated change management across teams.
Okay, great. So that almost reminds me of the concept in the marketing called growth hacking, which has the
Yeah.
same type of team structure.
Yeah.
You put together a marketer and the programmers and the scrum master or something, like a project manager in small teams, and they test individual changes, for example, on a website and measure it and improve it. And but decisions
Right.
are made quickly. They don't impact the entire site, and the deployment process is such that it can be deployed like that. So that's very interesting. I think that's an important organizational change that you mentioned.
Yeah, but it's very large though. I mean, it's a big organizational change. It takes a lot of top-down leadership to make that happen. But once you get to that point, you can have all of these teams operating independently, right? And you could
Okay.
have hundreds of microservices across the entire organization. And when you get to that point, it's great because each of these teams can be releasing to production 5, 10, 15 times a day,
Right.
right? All that matters is that
Right.
it's an API or a UI and that it's available. And that team then has the responsibility. And it's even better because then you can point to that team and say, you know what, guys, you did a really good job.
Right.
The profile is up and it's available and everybody loves it. Good job.
Mm-hmm.
Or if that profile is down, you can point to them and say, you are at fault. Not that you would, but you can point to them and say, look, you guys screwed this up, right? Go fix it, right?
Right. At
So
least
you
you
have
know who needs to fix it right away, quickly.
responsibility and you have freedom and you have accountability. So those three things coming together makes a really big difference. And that's why startups are so innovative, by the way,
Right.
right? Because a startup is basically a microservice, right? It's 10
Exactly.
people in a garage somewhere. And when you're not encumbered by these big organizations, you can do a lot of really innovative work. So,
Right.
it's taking that same concept and applying it to enterprises and then allowing each of those teams to innovate however they want to.
Okay. So taking that and applying it to the concept of a retail organization, a retailer. Let's say, you have different sizes. You have national chains that have thousands of locations, and you have smaller companies that maybe have 5 locations. Um, it's going to be different applying that to these different types of organizations. It's probably going to be a lot easier to do it in a smaller organization, but they don't build their own software, right? They're always using their vendor's software. So how would a retailer use this in their own organization when they are using somebody else's software?
It's generally incompatible with somebody else's software. So I think what you're referring to is if somebody buys a big packaged e-commerce platform or a big packaged retail platform. And if you do that, um, which is fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no problem with doing that, but you can't do microservices because everything in the application, it's one big monolithic application that you end up customizing. And as a result, there are a lot of dependencies between all these different pieces. And with all those dependencies, then you can't break up into these small teams. Right? The
Right.
whole point of microservices is you have to break apart the teams so that each team is very, very loosely coupled. And if you have a big, tightly coupled monolith, you can't do that. Now, honestly, there are efficiencies to having a big monolithic application, right? Because you can do much more richer personalization and integration, right? There are a lot of advantages to that. But when you get to be a certain size, or even if you're not a certain size, I mean, even small organizations can benefit from this too. You need to start decomposing things into these small microservices style applications.
Okay. So it could even be probably, um, there's between, I guess, 0 and 100, where at 0 you have no microservices organization structure, and then at 100 you're fully there.
Right.
There is a road that people have to take. What is, let's say, what would be because I mean, of course, it's really difficult to make an overnight change in everything, right? So, what are the best ways that you found to move through that journey?
What we found to work best, and what we see a lot of our customers do, is they say, all right, we've got this big monolithic application that has 5 million lines of code, right? We have 300 people working on it, and it's getting to be complex enough where they only do releases once every quarter or maybe twice a year, right? And that's pretty common. And what they'll do is they'll say, all right, let's set up a parallel platform for microservices, right? And you get a platform, you set it up, and then a requirement will come along like, let's say, for example, somebody wants to overhaul how they do inventory. And instead of going and overhauling how they do inventory in the monolithic application, the big packaged application, instead what they'll do is they'll form a team of 10 people and they'll say, all right, you 10 are now responsible for inventory. This is the API that we want to call you at. And then they will go off and re-implement inventory in a microservice. And then as the monolith can then consume that API as a microservice. And you can replicate that. So you can say, all right, well, now we've got inventory out. Well, why don't we move profile out now? Why don't we do promotion evaluation? Let's pull that out. Let's do pricing. Let's do product catalog. And over the course of 5 years, something like that, you'll get to a point where most of your business logic is implemented in these microservices. And you say, you know what, let's get rid of our monolithic application, right?
And by that time, I think a lot of the monolithic applications are also thinking about how this sort of like an agile process of building things, and they'll probably be evolving towards that. I think at least, the ones that I know about, I see things going towards the cloud, and hopefully when you go to the cloud, you start to use some of these things. Hopefully.
Yeah. I think this is clearly, microservices is clearly the direction. And we've seen all the big e-commerce giants out there do it. And people seem to be implementing, they seem to be building net new platforms now as they re-platform. It's just something more custom than packaged. And the architecture that naturally lends itself to these big, enormous, complicated applications is this microservices style. So it's a natural evolution. And I would expect to see the packaged vendors move to this model as well, where you can start consuming things as a service. But again, I want to make a point, right? There's a big difference between a monolithic application exposing a couple of APIs and a true microservices style commerce solution. They're very different. And I think we'll see a whole range of solutions hit the market over the coming years as more and more adopt this style. I think we'll see something for everyone out there in the marketplace.
Okay. And of course, I think with this kind of a software model, there's probably going to be a different business model, revenue model, right? Because you can't charge people the same way with the software model. So it's going to be interesting how the larger companies, the larger vendors are going to move into that direction and still have a viable, business.
Yeah, and clearly the trend has been towards software as a service, and everybody's making big investments in commerce as a service. We're starting to see people make investments in commerce APIs as a service, but clearly enterprise IT vendors are moving in that direction already, and commerce will naturally follow from that.
Okay. So if somebody, again, looking at retail and how this applies to a retailer's life right now, I'm thinking, what would a retailer think about right now, and how would they strategize moving forward if they really want to plan this way with the microservices for the future?
Well, I fully realize that enterprises cannot just blow up their organizations and do a complete restructuring overnight, right? And it's not very feasible, right? And what do you do if you're the CIO and you have a VP of Ops and a VP of Development? How do you go to those two people and say, "Yeah, I'm sorry, but you guys are both fired, and your teams are going to be distributed across the 30 different microservices," right? You can't do that. right? And no other organization, in organizations, people are segmented by what they do. So the accountants have, a finance lead, right? And they all work for the same manager. You have people who, who run warehouses. They all are all managed by the same person. So to all of a sudden say, yeah, we're going to restructure around this whole concept of microservices, that's a pretty radical thing to do to an org chart. But we've seen this before. So when mobile came around in the early 2000s, we saw people say, generally the reaction was, mobile's really interesting. We have to do something, but my existing organization can't do it. Therefore, here are 10 people. I don't know what this thing is, but you 10 people go out there and figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And even today, that's how it works. Most retailers have a small team, although it's increasing in size, and they just do mobile. And it's a complete separate silo, completely isolated. And that model has proven to work pretty well. And you just have to continue that model and say, you know what, we're going to do this now to our application.
Okay, so mobile as a microservice almost.
Kind of. It's more
Kind
that
of,
you'd
yeah.
want to break apart. So what we need to get to as an industry is where today we typically have these big old ancient systems that run the business, right? These are retail point of sale systems, retail management systems, big boring old software,
Order
and
management
then
systems, yeah.
order management warehouse,
Yeah.
and then we have an e-commerce front end on top of that, and then mobile's typically an offshoot of that. And where we need to get to as an industry is where we have these small microservices across the business. So we've talked about omni-channel commerce forever,
Mm-hmm.
right? For a decade
Right.
now. And microservices really allows us to do it, where we actually have a single inventory service for the entire enterprise, right? We have a single
Right.
pricing. And when you do that, it actually solves a lot of problems because now you don't have to call between all of these different systems. You don't have all that complex integration work because there's only one source of truth.
Right.
So what you have to get to is where you're slowly replacing or augmenting these old systems with microservices, and then you put different UIs on top of them. And imagine a scenario where you have, as an enterprise, you have 300 different microservices, and each of those microservices corresponds to one aspect of your business, right? So you've got one customer master, you've got one product master, you've got one inventory master, and then you can slap whatever UI on top of it you want. So you could have a team, you could publish those APIs, and you could give them to a creative agency and say, build me a new point of sale system and run it on an iPad, or build me a browser-based application, right? And now when you have that big pool of APIs, anybody can build any type of of client that they want. And that's really the model we have to get to.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, as I think about even just the mobile side of it itself, for example, if you're doing development on Android, you have so many different devices and device sizes and things like that. I wonder if each one of those can even be a service in and of itself for a specific size.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty
And,
interesting.
there's a concept called a front end for your back end, and or a back end for your front end, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But that is, when you have all these microservices, when you hit an Amazon.com product detail page, behind the scenes, there are 134 different microservices. And clearly a browser-based application can't make 134 calls back to different microservices. You need one thing to render that entire page for you. And there are two general patterns for that. The first is an API gateway pattern, which is to say, it's kind of like a load balancer, right? And that load balancer will then make all of those calls for you.
Mm-hmm.
But you have a challenge then, which is that then becomes a monolithic application and it introduces very tight coupling, right?
Right.
Because now you've got one API gateway and it is the aggregation tier across all of the microservices, and it inevitably ends up doing a lot of coordination between them, which is tight coupling, which is against the whole purpose of microservices. The other approach, and this is what we're doing at Oracle, is to have you build microservices that do this aggregation for you. In other words, you would say, I'm going to build a category display microservice, and I'm going to build a category display microservice for a mobile app. I'll build another category display microservice for a web app, because what you return to mobile and what you return to web are very, very different things. And whoever owns that category microservice will also own the iPhone category microservice, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
the device specific ones should actually be very, very thin shims where you just are displaying exactly what it is that that device requires.
Okay.
So there are a lot of different ways to do it, but it's a very exciting new model, and you can imagine how powerful this would be to an enterprise.
Yeah, definitely. So I think there is two different. If I was to categorize the size of the customer, the organization, large, very large, where they have their own internal teams, software developers that are doing it, and smaller, where they heavily rely on outside vendors for any kind of customization and things like that. For them, then looks like the decision would be starting to look at packages that are open so that they can take in external APIs without too much of a customization.
Yeah, and another way to look at this is you could say, I want this system integrator, custom integrator X. You get these 3 microservices, right?
Right.
And you build them, you run them, you manage them, and as long as those are available as a service, and as long as you're up, whatever your SLA is, maybe you do 5 nines of availability, we'll pay you, right? But if you don't, if you screw it up, we're going to withhold pay.
Mm-hmm.
But it's nice because the microservices model is not just an extra pair of hands, it's true accountability, and you can measure the work that they're doing. And that's in part how microservices has really changed how SIs are delivering software, because now they have a very clear scope, right?
Right.
And they can be measured based on how well they've implemented that.
Right. Right. What about, so as you mentioned, all the different, let's say hundreds of different microservices or services that are being built. What about code quality across all these different groups? How do you maintain that? Is that something like that the platform handles, or?
Generally, each team is responsible for their own code quality. And the general philosophy of microservices, again, this is more academic, but the general philosophy of microservices is each team has radical independence. Right? If you talk to some practitioners, they would say, as long as that API is available, I don't care what happens behind the scenes. Right? It could be the most garbage throwaway code in the world. I don't care, because I'm consuming it as a service. And as long as that team is able to deliver, I don't care what they're doing. Right? So that's one approach. The other approach is more of the enterprise heavy approach, which is I'm going to give each team a very, very small box in which to work, and they'll have very centralized management and coordination. But then again, you run into the problem of too much coordination and too much centralization.
Right.
And if you think about it, a good analogy is kind of like countries, right? So if you think of a lot of the microservices practitioners today, they call for kind of this radical openness, right? So, think of that as like, I don't know, think of it as Somalia, right? There's no government in place.
Okay.
You can have feuding warlords, like nobody really cares what happens there, right? And the other approach, which is the more enterprise approach, is kind of 70s and 80s USSR, which is there's a centralized government and there's the KGB always sticking their nose in what you're doing, and you have Stalin ready to send you away, right? And everything is very centralized and planned and coordinated and controlled. And I think the right model is kind of the EU or the US model. Think of it like the US model, where you have a centralized government, and that government provides things like national defense and a common currency.
Right.
And in microservices, you need some of those things too, because you need to standardize on how you communicate between things. You need a centralized management platform, a centralized logging platform. But each state is able to implement what it wants to, right? And some states implement some pretty crazy laws. Others don't, right? But each state has the ability to implement whatever it is that they like. And that is kind of a good model where you have some overarching standards and coordination and collaboration, right? Same with the
Hmm.
European Union, right? But you don't have that micromanaging, right? So you don't want to be Somalia, you don't want to be,
Right.
USSR. You kind of want to be that US model or EU model where it's a good combination of those two.
Okay. So the I think there's definitely pros and cons on both of those. I mean, I can see like when we talk about distributed decision making between the different states. You want to get a license, driver license in California. It's a completely different process than getting it in Oregon and Washington, and they don't talk to each other, and so there's
Right.
has to be some standardized communication, some just like some centralized services or standards, and then within that, then you have the freedom. So I think it sounds like it's got to be like a balance, just like you said. Hopefully it won't get to be like the US Congress. Now we're getting into political
Yes.
political discussions, but I think that's something most everybody agrees on. So
But
um,
a lot of enterprises would say, wait a second, we have to standardize everything because when you standardize on things, you save money, right? And they say, we just want to buy, we want one site-wide license for Oracle database, right? We want one site-wide license for WebLogic. And they'll go out and say, that makes sense. And then they'll force that on their teams. But with these more innovative style of applications, you want each team to pick whatever they want to do. I
so
mean,
they could
within reason.
actually pick their own database.
Well, in the true microservices model, a lot of people would say that each team gets complete control over what database they use, right?
Interesting. Okay.
But I think the right enterprise model is to say we are going to give each team a selection of one or two products per segment. So you'd say, all right, well, you can select Oracle database or MySQL for your relational database. You can select MongoDB or Berkeley DB for your NoSQL database, right? You can select, you know, Terracotta or Coherence for your object store, but it's to give them a select menu to choose from. So
Okay.
they have freedom to choose the right products or the right solutions for their needs, but they don't have complete choice where they can't just go download some random product from GitHub,
Right.
version zero point 0.2 of something, and then they have to support it themselves. So again, it's a balancing act.
Right, right. Yeah, I think the government example or model is a good one to think about. So um, now, are there any standards across the industry that are being developed for microservices? So I mean, this is within an organization, but let's say I see that smaller companies would be able to go to a marketplace, a services marketplace, and say, I want a shopping cart service, I want review service, and I want to plug them in and get my applications running. I want an order service, things like that.
Not, no, not to that degree. So I think the only standards are kind of de facto standards. So I think REST is very popular, of course, for communication between them. And if you can publish a REST endpoint, just about anybody can consume it from any type of environment. But and Docker is emerging as a standard for containers. Kubernetes and Mesos are emerging as standards kind of for that container orchestration layer. Mesos and Marathon, that is. Um, but there's no real standard, I guess. There's no marketplace as far as I know of for commerce services. It's not like you can go somewhere and pick your shopping cart implementation. Although that'd be kind of nice if you could do that.
Yeah, I have a feeling we're gonna move towards that because it's a great situation to be as a customer.
Oh yeah. Hey Darius, you want to start a business?
Let me get through the one I have right now. So, but I'm sure many smart people are working on that. So,
I'm sure
I'm
it's a
excited to
natural.
see, yeah, what things are coming up. Now, what about maybe a couple of examples that you can give us of like retailers that are using microservices?
So Guild Group, for example, has done microservices quite extensively. Their entire platform is based on that. They deploy to a public cloud so they can scale up and scale down. It's really a beautiful model. And if you go to slideshare.net or if you go to YouTube, they've given a lot of talks as well. Um, they have a bit of an interesting model, though. And what's interesting about their model is that they extend, each team owns the UI as well. And what that means is the profile team owns the profile UI. And that's a bit unique.
Very interesting.
But just about everybody else out there, they just own up to the API.
Okay.
But
that's like total freedom. That's
it is. It is. So you just go to portal.gilt.com, or sorry, profile.gilt.com, and that hits a different microservice. It's completely different. Amazon has famously done microservices for a long time. They called it, and it was more of SOA at the beginning. This was roughly 2006, but it's since migrated to more of a pure microservices architecture. eBay has done it. I mean, again, just about everybody out there, Walmart.com is just about everybody out there who's doing this e-commerce at scale. I mean, really, really big scale. We're talking, internet retailer top 10, those guys are doing this, and it's very rapidly moving down market.
Yeah, I think it would be great to see this actually going down to even and I mean, there are definitely companies innovating on the other end. So for example, like Shopify or even Salesforce.com with their own app store. So these apps are basically considered microservices, right? They're like microservices. When you can go to what do you call it, like a marketplace, and plug something onto your website right there from there.
Kind of. I mean, their core application is not a microservice. So you can consume your commerce platform, and that's kind of a monolithic style application. It's SaaS basically. But what they do offer is, all these guys offer marketplaces where you can say, I want the PayPal payment plugin, and that's more of a plugin model. But yeah, it's the same general concept. PayPal manages their own plugin for Shopify. They release it whenever they want to, and as long as they don't break the API, everybody's happy with it.
Right.
So it's a concept. But with microservices and commerce, this is more about building it on premises from scratch, building it in-house, and then deploying it either in-house or to a public cloud. Right. It's kind of a different model, but it's the same general concept.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, this is really exciting, fascinating stuff that's going on. So just like if we were to talk about like two or three key takeaways, would it be the first one is really the organizational structure?
Yes. Put Conway's Law to work for you.
Okay.
Because the structure of the organization dictates the structure of the software.
Okay. The second one would be what? Like put together some kind of like the governmental organization that allows you to have some standards but also provide freedom to each team.
Yeah, figure out your governance model.
Okay.
Right? Figure out, right, clearly there have to be some standards. Figure out what areas of the stack you're going to standardize on, and generally how you're going to structure your team and run things, right? What are your policies and procedures? Who owns what? Make it so that the user knows what their box is, what each team knows what they can put in their own box.
Okay.
Right?
Great. Yes. And then maybe the last one is, if you are looking at, vendors, software, make sure they have a robust REST API, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Your vendors should be moving in this direction, because clearly that old model of having a big single monolithic application deployed to one on-premises data center, that model is dead. And I expect people who are doing that today to be looking for something a little newer and a little more flexible. And I think API first, or strong API support, I think is a good way to start to look at things.
Right. Okay, great. Well, this is it's been exciting. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm gonna add some of your contact information in the notes, and we'll find some of the links to the products or things that you mentioned, like the Conway's Law. I think would be good to put a link of that in the notes. But thank you so much, Kelly, and I look forward to hearing more and more about what you're working on.